I want to introduce very quickly our panel. We have over here Beth White. Beth is the director of our peer-to-peer coaching program that we implemented at Indiana Wesleyan, but that program now is being taken to other colleges across the United States where we hire and train and prepare peer coaches. So she's going to be talking about that model today. Phil Gillette. Phil runs our high school programs, and we're taking our high school programs nationally and internationally. One of the programs we have for that is a stewardship course. Another one is biblical financial planning for high school students to help them to choose the college of their dreams within their means. And then we have Shane Wybrew. Shane has been a part of our stewardship thought leadership consultant group for several years. And he was at Grace Church, and we implemented a pilot at Grace Church. And so we're going to be talking mostly about that pilot, how we build upon God Owns It All, and how we have begun to integrate the Nexus Peer Coaching Program with lay leaders at churches as we begin to address that gap of needing 100,000 Christian financial advisors out there. And so the panel will be coming up and presenting and then answering questions with you at the end. How many pastors do we have here this afternoon? Okay, I see a number throughout the room of pastors. How many kingdom advisors are in the group? Okay, I see a lot more hands going up. How many are a part of a Kingdom Advisor study group? Okay, almost as many hands just went up for that. And how many of you have been involved in teaching or participating in a God Owns It All church study group in your respective churches? Okay, I only see a couple, three handfuls of students with that. Well, that lays the foundation of what we want to be talking about today. And I'm going to move over here to the side. We've got some statistics, and we just simply want to build a case. And this is not new news to you, but it's a reminder. It's a validation of the sense of urgency that we have out there to have Christian financial advisors and Christian financial coaches in the industry. The mortgage debt in America is $9.4 trillion. The student debt is now about $1.6 trillion. The auto loan debt is about $1.27 trillion. Credit card debt is about $834 billion, and personal loan debt is $291 billion. We were contacted through the Christian Council of Colleges and Universities last week by the U.S. Treasury Department, wanting to know what we're doing in the high school and the college and the church space as we address debt. And so that's kind of a new breakthrough for us, and we're looking forward to that dialogue. Personal finance statistics. 49% of Americans are concerned, anxious, and stressed about finances. Ron and Rob have already talked about contentment today. 50% of households live paycheck to paycheck. 67% of Americans have less than $1,000 for emergencies. 38% of households have credit card debt. 29% of households 55 and over have no retirement savings or pension. So there's a serious issue out there, and a lot of times accountability coaches or peer coaches coming alongside can make a big difference. They're not selling product, they're not selling services, they're not certified financial planners, but they can step into that gap as we zap that gap between the number of certified kingdom advisors we have today and that 100,000 that we want. Often Rob and I will talk about 10,000, but when we talk 10,000, Ron talks 100,000. And so we keep moving up the scale there. 10 million North American families desire a Christian financial advisor. Money and Wise Radio, Rob said this morning, I think he said 147 requests a day for a financial advisor. We need 100,000 CKAs to serve 10 million Christian families. That's why we're trying to zap that gap with peer coaches in the churches across the country. And lay leaders can help with this intermediate financial coaching. And so that's the premise of what we've got. We've been a part of a cohort with the Thrive It Financial, with Brotherhood Mutual, with Indiana Wesleyan, with the Wesleyan Church, and of course the Ron Blue Institute. And the title of our work has been Healthy Pastors Can Build Healthy Churches. But there are two key indicators of a healthy church. One is stewardship. The second is generosity. And so we're focusing on that. One of the things that we've learned, we built the God Owns It All church curriculum about 4 years ago. We did that through Broadman Holman and through Lifeway Resources. That's a church kit of 6 videos and a study guide for biblical curriculum. But what we're learning, where that is implemented, a lot of the people are not buying the study guide and they don't have a coach. And what we know about education is that biblical financial education plus an accountability factor, whether that's assessment, whether that's a teacher, whether that's a coach, whether that's an advisor or an accountability partner, the biblical financial coaching taken together with biblical financial education equates to biblically wise financial decision making. The genesis of everything, when Ron approached the university, I was working in the administration building. The Ron Blue Institute is its own LLC. We lease space at Indiana Wesleyan. So we're not a direct part of Indiana Wesleyan. However, we implement programs there and use that as a proving ground. But the genesis of everything that we've been doing started with Master Your Money and then all of Ron's other intellectual property. And our task simply was to begin to take that information, bring it current, and contextualize it to the high school, to the church, to the university, build a continuum of curriculum through that. And so that's what we've been doing the last 4 years. You've already seen that today, but Ron's 5 uses of money and the 5 principles of using that money undergird most everything of what we're teaching at the respective levels. We did a pilot. I had written a grant through Thrive It Financial and also through the Wesleyan Church last year. And we decided that we wanted to invite 4 churches from across the country: Orlando, Atlanta, Indianapolis, and Marion, Michigan, excuse me. So we did that. We brought them to 12 Stone Church in Atlanta, scholarship the senior pastor and associate pastor, their spouses, as well as 2 lay leaders and their spouses. And we did 3 days of training, and primarily Beth and Michael Blue and Karen Guess were the designers of that and the curriculum writers of that. That established then a pilot. We were asking those 4 churches to go back home and teach God Owns It All and to use the base of those students going through God Owns It All for their peer coaches to begin coming alongside and discipling or coaching those people, to be an accountability partner, if you will. And so we're going to be telling the story today about Grace Church and what's been happening at Grace Church. And we would love to see that happen throughout the city of Indianapolis and throughout the United States. At this point, I'm going to ask Beth come up. She's going to talk a little bit about the Nexus program. Then Phil will share a little bit because he was a part of the Grace Pilot and the For Soil group there along with Shane. And then we'll get into hearing from Shane and Q&A.
All right, so I get to talk about a little bit of the foundation of how we started looking at the financial coaching within the church. And you would think it would start within RBI, but let me back up a little bit and say It actually started when I was under the age of 10. And this is how it works. My mama taught me the importance of giving to the church, the importance of saving and what that looks like, the importance of how you spend your money. She taught me through words. She taught me through different acts, like I did bake sales and I ran our yard sales and all of those fun things. And then on top of that, whether I didn't choose this one, but I learned the empathy part of finances from my parents' divorce. And the divorce did not come solely because of finances, but I saw the pain and the problems that the finances did cause in the relationship. I also saw the pain that it caused some of my siblings, and I thought to myself, I don't want people to have to go through this same thing. So that's where the seed was planted in my heart. As I looked towards college and dreamed about college, I thought, I saw my brother struggle through college because my parents weren't able to provide a lot of support in that, and so I wanted to prepare in that sense. So I set a goal early, around the age of 14, to graduate with $15,000 in debt, and set a plan, started saving, doing those different things. I got to college, worked throughout college, tried to work anywhere from like 10 to 25 hours a week, different things like that. And when it got to graduation, I realized that I would not quite meet my goal. I would graduate with $16,000 in debt. And to be honest, I was kind of bummed at first because I didn't hit my goal. But I realized that goals are much more than that, and what you're learning through that biblically is the more important part of that. So I reframed that, and I thought, okay, so after graduation, I want to pay this off in 2 years. So I was lucky enough to get a job that paid for my housing for a few months after college. I then went into a management program where I chose to live with my mom, and I know there's a bad stigma on that, so I wrestled with that, being like, I'm the college person who moved back in with their parents. But through that prayer, God said, Beth, it's not about that stigma. It's not about that. It's about the heart of it and making sure you're choosing what I want you to choose. I don't care what other people think or say about you. So I did that, and then actually ended up transitioning into event planning and came back to Indiana. And I actually ended up paying my debt off in 10 months. So that's the way God works. When I have a plan for 2 years, he says, I'm going to show you what I really can do, and I'm going to help you pay it off in 10 months. So I was working in events, and I met Dr. Larry Lindsay, who was working the event as well, and I said, the Ron Blue Institute, that's interesting. That's something I'm really passionate about. Just like some of the other speakers have said, I didn't plan to necessarily go into finances for my job. But Dr. Lindsay asked me to sit down for coffee, and when I sat down for coffee, the next thing I know, I was being offered a position. And once again, those are things that I can't plan, that God plans. And when I did join the Ron Blue Institute team, one of the things that they were working on was peer counseling, the idea of peer counseling. They had looked at different state schools who had peer counseling and said, we want to do something similar. And that brought up all of those passions that I talked about, the things that my mom taught me, all of those things. And I said, I love this. I'm going to take this and run with it. And I love Ron's biblical principles and putting that as the foundation of it, because while a lot of other secular schools had peer counseling, no one had biblical financial peer counseling at the university. So we started by looking at other universities in, me personally, in January of 2016. And by fall of 2016, we started our peer financial counseling center, or coaching center. And you might ask, what does that look like on a college campus? Because we're not certified, we don't have any of the series tests, we don't have the CFP yet, we're not to that stage. But as you know, there's a lot more to financial coaching and counseling than just the advice that you can give. We created this model called the DEEP model, and this is what we train our students to go through in each one of their meetings. So the D is for discipleship, and that is where we do a small devotion before we get into anything with finances. The next part is evaluate, and this part is extremely important and more important than students often think at first. But this is where you ask the questions to really understand where someone's coming to. It was mentioned earlier that you can talk about portfolios and all of those things in finances, but you can't really get to know the person well just by asking those questions. And so we focus on that area for coaching, and we train our peer coaches on campus to ask good questions, to ask about their past experiences. So, a coach for me would want to learn about the experience I had with my mom and learning from her. They would want to know about the experience I had with the divorce and how that shaped my thought on finances. So we teach them to ask those good questions to really get down to the deep, get down to the foundation. Then we educate, which educate is providing those tools, different tools that Kingdom Advisors has. We have several budgets of our own, and even the pie graph, looking at that foundational tool as well. And most importantly, the Simplifying the Money Conversation tool, that summarizes a lot of what we're looking at in biblical finances of saying, who owns this? We often, as humans, when we look at money, we start with what are my goals? But starting with who owns that is something that we really encourage our students to work through with the other students who come in. And then finally, we go through the prayer aspect of the meeting. And if you notice, we have discipleship at the beginning and prayer at the end, because it's so easy to go throughout our day and forget about our faith, or just say, all right, I'm going to start it that way, and then not put it into anything else. But we want it to be sandwiched within our meetings. And so with this program, it's been really exciting to see the number of students impacted just at Indiana Wesleyan University. We have anywhere from 4 to 6 coaches a year that we train. We go through exercises that they do in the summer. We go through about 40 hours of training before school, and then we do continuing education with those students as well. And then they're set free, and they get some observation time from me. But they work with each of the students on whether it be budgeting goals, savings goals, what does it look like to give. We had someone in freshman orientation this year that said, my parents taught me so well how to handle my money, and now I have all this money and I don't know what to do with it, which is very rare for a college area. But we said, you know what, that is awesome that you're at that point and you can come in and we can have that conversation of what does it look like to honor God with our money and giving, and what does that look like? So we have conversations of all levels. And I just want to show this testimony. The gist of the testimony on the screen is that the student was really intimidated to come in. They thought, I'm the only one that struggles with finances. If I come in, it'll be embarrassing. All my peers will look down on me for that. But what they found when they came in is that they were able to be heard by their coach. They were able to get that biblical foundation, create a plan, and have an accountability partner as they worked through that plan. And so that accountability, the discipleship is really important, and the students see by the end that we really care about them and we want their lives to be changed. So all that to say, this is the foundation of the peer coaching within the churches. We saw that it worked. We have dozens upon dozens of testimonies within the coaching realm in the university, both at Indiana Wesleyan University as well as Liberty, as well as Calvin, the different universities we've gone to. And we said, what would this look like if we could replicate this within the churches? There's a lot of people who want to be good with their money, but they don't want to go to an advisor yet because they don't have anything to manage. And so we said, what would it look like if we we're able to help in the churches provide the foundational coaching to get them to a better place mentally and with their health. And so as Dr. Lindsay talked about, Thrivent Financial helped us fund this kind of a retreat for a training in Atlanta. We worked with Connect Source, which is the coaching provider for MoneyWise Radio, to put the study material together for this group. And we went to Atlanta. We went through that training, essentially just what we do in the colleges. We wanted to put that into the church. And so we went through that training for the churches, and then have followed up with the churches from that time. And one of the amazing things that have come out of it is the story of Grace Church, and I'm going to let Phil Gillette share that story.
Thank you, Beth. My main role at RBI is to work with Christian high schools across the country. So I have to give a plug for that. I just can't get up and talk about what we're doing at Grace Church. If you have any kind of connection to a Christian school, whether it be a traditional school or homeschool, we have some wonderful products and courses that we could help you with in getting those into those schools. So please stop by our table. But as all of us do, I hope we are plugged into a local church and involved there in serving. And so I had the opportunity through Grace Church to join the Fourth Soil team. And to become involved in something I'm super passionate about was really a blessing. I have a really strong history in church. My dad was a pastor, and so I grew up in a home that valued church, and not the organization of the church, and not the buildings of the church, but the people of the church. People who are in need, who are sometimes hurting, sometimes critical, always broken in some way, but who are also loved and cared for and valued and called and important. And so I saw that lived out in the home I grew up in. And then to combine that with the idea of coaching. So I spent a lot of years in Christian schools coaching athletics. I was actually soccer, basketball, baseball, football. Actually was a cheerleading coach for one weird day. And then in discipleship and mentoring and small groups. So I've really had a passion for the relationships that occur while coaching. And so to kind of combine both of these things for me, the church and coaching, and within the realm that I'm involved in through Grace Church, has really been fantastic. And so we were able to, and Shane's going to talk a little bit more about that in a second, but we were able to, at Grace, begin a ministry that today is just exploding. And people of the church are recognizing that they have the need and are coming to the church for help and advice. And as Ron has said many times, why isn't the church seen as the focus and the focal point for wisdom about finances? And we're beginning to see that change. And so in the team that I coached with, we helped a family a husband and wife who are in significant debt, just horrific problems in their marriage, and begin to see that change, and where they were beginning to get back on a path together of dealing with the heart issue that caused them to be in debt. To meet with a single mom, just gone through a really terrible divorce, who is in significant debt, raising 3 kids on her own with a job that is often on, and living with her mom, and to cry with her and to pray with her and to disciple her, to keep her accountable to the things that she wanted to be accountable to. And then at the end of that, our time, to hear her say that she'd actually written a check to Grace Church as part of her giving, the first one ever, was just like a huge breakthrough for her. And so that's the kind of thing that we're beginning to see, and we hope that this could become a movement that would go throughout the United States in terms of helping people begin to understand that God owns it all. But what does that look like on a practical level? How does that help me where I'm at, even if I'm in deep distress or if I'm secure and stable? And so it's been a blessing for me to begin to live out what it talks about in Ephesians 4:15, to speak the truth in love. And that was always my dad's main idea, and so I'm trying to honor his legacy of doing that in the opportunities that I have in the ministry of the For Soil team. And we've asked our brother Shane to come and talk to you a little bit more about what that looked like at Grace, how that started, the impact and influence that that's had, and hopefully encourage you, motivate you, give you a path that you could start as well.
Thank you. Thanks, Phil. For the last 3 years or so, I was on staff at Grace Church up in Noblesville as the pastor of stewardship and resource development. And I began to collect a few people together and give birth to a stewardship team and we named ourselves the Fourth Soil Team, lifted from Mark chapter 4. We piloted God Owns It All as a curriculum, and one of the things that I felt through our strategic planning process with our stewardship team, one of the things we felt that was missing was this peer-to-peer financial coaching thing. I realized that the institute at Ron Blue Institute up at Indiana Wesleyan had the Nexus program, so we began to look at that and understand it. I felt very inadequate to lead this energy and effort at Grace, primarily because I didn't feel confident in finances. I've been 25 years in professional Christian fundraising, and now as the pastor of stewardship at Grace, everyone called me the money guy, and I certainly was not that. And even in my personal life, my wife of almost 23 years is my banker. I don't think I'd seen a pay stub since I've been married. And so I didn't feel very confident until about a year ago, one weekend at Grace, I was giving the offering meditation. And on Sunday afternoon of that weekend, I had an email in my inbox from a husband and wife who kind of detailed a little bit about their situation. And they said, "Shane, we know you're the money guy and we want to meet with you." And I go, here I go again. I'm not the financial person. You have no idea. But they said, we have nobody else to talk with and we'd like your help. Feeling very inadequate, I agreed to meet with them and sat down with a husband and wife and was just brokenhearted to hear their story. Living in a $500,000 home with 2 leased vehicles. Come to find out, they realized a couple months before they met with me that they were spending $2,000 to $3,000 a month on groceries and eating out. To which I wanted to say, would you adopt me? Like, how do you do that? They had 6 figures of consumer debt with not one thing to show that they bought. And they didn't know what to do. Through their tears and mine, we sat for an hour and I listened. I didn't feel adequate to help them, but I began to listen. What I realized is we began to take, as a team at Grace, resources from Thrivent and the Ron Blue Institute to bear on these conversations. And it was very helpful. I sat down with a 75-year-old lady who was a widow, been married 6 months shy of 40 years. And she said, "Shane," she said, "I need your help because I was a single child and my parents spoiled me rotten. And when I left home, I got married and my husband spoiled me rotten too. And he died 4 years ago and I've never lived on a budget. I don't even know what a budget is, but she said, before I die, I want to get this right with God." That's amazing, incredible. And had the privilege to sit down with her several different sessions, walking through the content from RBI and Thrivent. Amazing. One of my favorite coaching sessions began with a husband and wife. We get into the room and I said, "Well, so what brings you here today?" And the wife says right away, she said, "We went through week 8 of Rooted, which is a 10-week small group experience that Grace utilizes." And she said, "The next morning I woke up and I looked at my husband and said, 'We've got to sell the boat.' And she said, that's what we're doing here. Come to find out, a husband and wife, been married 6 or 7 years, no children, both with working and very good incomes. And they said they would oftentimes, it'd be the middle of the week, Wednesday or Thursday, and they'd look at each other and say, what do you want to do this weekend? And they'd book flights to San Francisco and spend the weekend in San Francisco and come home. And they just said, we're exhausted. And we know we can't live this way. But we don't know what to do. That's unbelievable. That you can take some of the content from Thriving and RBI and bring to bear on these conversations. Our team at Grace, even though I'm no longer serving as pastor of stewardship and resource development at Grace, it has taken off. Dave Rodriguez did a stewardship series in the month of September and publicly announced from the pulpit that Grace had a peer financial coaching team. Overnight, 45 families said, help, we can't do this. We need some help. But overnight, also, about 50 people raised their hand from Grace Church and said, you guys do peer financial coaching? I'd love to help. And so it's a way to engage volunteers in this conversation, discipling people because of who Jesus is. At this point, I'll turn it back over to you, Dr. Lindsay, for questions.
Yes, we're going to engage in a session of Q&A for a few minutes, but you've got a little bit of the big picture of where we are. And when Ron first came to the university, and that was back in 2011, 2012, I was chief of staff and vice president for strategic initiatives, and our provost was working with Ron. But we began to look and say, well, what Ron's got, as we contextualize it, how can every Indiana Wesleyan University graduate being able to make biblically wise financial decisions, understanding stewardship, and learning to give generously or to live generously? And so we began to look at that, but Ron is kind of a small thinker, and he said, well, why don't we take that to all of the colleges and universities across the country? And so now we are thinking bigger because we say all university students will be able to make biblically wise financial decisions, understand stewardship, and live generously. But then we began to look at the God owns it all, and we began to say, well, what can we do in the Wesleyan Church with God owns it all, and how might we go from there? And Ron's idea is saying, well, if we're dealing with the Wesleyan Church, why don't we deal with all churches across the United States? And so we've continued to expand that to the place that what you saw on the screen earlier is we're beginning to say we're going to be able to share with every Christian biblical financial wisdom. You've heard a lot today from 2 or 3 of our speakers, including Rob, where they've been talking about meaning and purpose. And Rob was talking about activation as one of the things. And in that statement, he referred to God owns it all. But we have God owns it all. We have peer counseling. We have the high school program. We have the homeschool program. We have university programs. We're trying to build the Nexus Peer Coaching to 100 and some colleges across the United States. We're already in a number of them, and that program is working very well under Beth's leadership. But when Rob mentioned activation, what really stirred in my spirit is that we need people to come along and help the churches to get up and running. Maybe buy the God Owns It All church kit, maybe help to facilitate that group, maybe help us to help them to train peer coaches, to take the program, as Phil said, to Christian high schools in the area or homeschools in the area, or maybe even after school workshops in public schools. My son is a superintendent in Marion. We're teaching the 5 uses of money, the live, give, owe, and grow in the Marion community schools now. And so there are a lot of opportunities out there where we want to engage you. But we want to pause now and open it up for Q&A.
So within Grace, trying to make this practically work within a church body, I want to make sure that we have good advice and good quality advice that's given to people. Do you run through a training program for your counselors? Is there an overseeing? How do you make sure that we're taking on this responsibility as a church to try to give good counsel? And if you just have somewhat untrained, unexperienced lay people giving that advice, it makes me, quite frankly, a little nervous that we're going to give good advice.
Right. At any point, you guys could interrupt me as far as that goes, even you, Brent. But for us at Grace Church, we had to start somewhere. Of course, the first caveat we give is obviously I have no initials after my name. I'm not a financial planner. As a matter of fact, I'm not a prophet, the son of a prophet. As a matter of fact, I work for a nonprofit organization. But anyway, we don't give advice. It is legitimately, it's as much of anything pastoral through listening and asking good questions. The content that we provide is fundamental biblical wisdom that doesn't change. Now, there are people who that's a great start and they need something more. And at Grace, as a kingdom advisor, I used KA as a way to vet the referrals that might come, people who ask me either to become a referral source, and I got a lot of breakfasts and lunches paid for free, or somebody saying, hey, I need help, and who can I talk with? And I used kingdom advisors as a way to vet those resources who might get a referral from me at Grace, if that makes sense. Brent or Phil, anything else you guys want to?
I wanted to follow through on that. At IW, when we developed the Nexus program, we've developed, Beth has updated it every year, but we have a 120 page sort of franchise model, deals with all of the ways in which we screen and hire students, the ways in which we do 40 hours of training for them before they get up and running. We do continuing ed every other week. We monitor them and they collect things, but we make it very, very clear that they are not financial counselors or they are not financial advisors. They're there to disciple, be an accountability partner, to pray. But what they will do when a student is wanting to monitor how much they're spending, they'll give them a tool and help them to trace that. If they're wanting to build a budget, they'll give them a tool on how to do that. If they need to set a goal, many of them learn to set a goal and will begin to do that. In terms of the church space, we have interacted mostly with Gateway Church, but a number of other churches, Eastern Star here. And what have they been doing about stewardship coaches or stewardship pastors? How have they been trying to raise up lay leaders? And a part of our vision is that we've been saying that we want to plug that gap between the 100,000 that we see of certified kingdom advisors out there and the 5 or so thousand that we actually have at this point. So our thinking has been that we would provide each of these church teams a list of preferred Christian financial advisors, whether that's Morgan Stanley, whether that's Ameriprise, or whatever the organization. Here's a list of financial advisors. If they want to invest, if they want to do a much more deep financial analysis or to build a financial plan, or they need fee-based or just they need advice from a professional. So we want to be a linking pin in that process. Ron, did you have a comment on that one? Okay. Any other questions at this point?
Thank you. At our church, we've been trying to build financial coaching, and we have a benevolence group, and we kind of have everything in place. But we're a church that has 7 campuses, and I think the biggest obstacle is that we're not getting blessing from the pastors. I think when you said that Pastor David Rodriguez said something about it, announced that publicly, that the doors came open. So we've been trying to do this for probably 2 or 3 years, and we know the demand is there, but we just don't get the people coming in. So can you help us through that, or help me through that? Because that's kind of a hard thing to handle as a lay person trying to talk to a pastor or something like that, that they may be the obstacle. I don't know if that's...
You've really put your finger on the issue. Generous Church that's been going now for 10, 12, 15 years, they have found that unless the lead pastor has a lifestyle that models stewardship and it's a part of him, it won't happen. It's kind of like if his thing is discipleship or missions or whatever it may be, but in terms of financial stewardship and generosity, the pastor's the lead guy. And Shane shared with me on the way over here that Dave Rodriguez is the chairman of their stewardship committee. So he's the pastor. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do some things, but it will help you to stop beating your head against the door or the wall if you're not getting that. I think the God Owns It All curriculum is transformational in nature. You can train coaches, but you may not. The other thing that's a complexity is I found that the megachurch with multiple campuses, it's really hard. I hate to be so encouraging, but when you have multiple campuses with multiple pastors, it's a whole different issue in setting up a stewardship ministry. So pray. Okay, because I don't have the answer. I just have a lot of observations.
I wanted to add to that. Over the last year, Michael Blue works out of our Austin office, and he's the executive director for Church and Professional. And Michael's become a prolific author as well. But over the last year, Michael developed a course called Modeling and Teaching Biblical Personal Finance or Personal Finance. And he taught that in our seminary to MDiv students last summer. And we're looking at taking that course online, but we think that we can take that and build that into a certificate course that would not be a 4-credit course, but it would be a professional development course for pastors. But as we worked with Brotherhood Mutual, as we worked with the Wesleyan Church, and we're working with colleges now, whether it's Assemblies of God or whether it's Nazarene, whether it's Wesleyan, whether it's Christian Missionary Alliance, whether it's Christian Reform, they're all representing different denominations out there, and we're finding that they're a real sphere of influence because who's training the pastor? It's the Bible school, it's the seminary, it's the School of Theology and Ministry and so on. So there's an opportunity, and coming back to the first question, how do we qualify people? Now, Beth, for example, is an accredited financial counselor, and so we've got a little bit of credibility there, and we had Justin Henniger on our team, who was a CFP and CKA, and now we have those kind of people throughout the United States that are working with us. But we can see this whole process maybe becoming a certificate program for pastors. So many of the pastors we're dealing with are bivocational. And what we're learning, and when I was talking with David Thompson last week at Gateway Church there at Southlake, Texas, where they've been huge with this whole stewardship thing and the peer coaching thing, what we're learning there is that it may not be the senior pastor. We need commitment from the senior pastor. But the senior pastor is very, very busy. So it's going to be an associate pastor or someone there that would have the responsibility, like Shane had at Grace, or like we have here at Eastern Star. But you need that commitment from the top, but then you need that ongoing continuing ed and ongoing iron sharpening iron. I would hasten to add that we have, Greg is here, and I don't see Lane right now. There's Lane back there and Brent over here. What they've done is they've developed a workshop to go to Grace and offer that workshop, and that drills down much deeper than what we were doing with God Owns It All, which was that basic foundation. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what we've got there, and I think we've got 6 minutes.
And 34 seconds. Just imagine with me that if we can get into the Christian high schools and begin to introduce the basics of biblical finance, and if we can get into the universities, I look at the church issue is we're going to get the pre-pastor. And we've got an opportunity by going to academia to influence coming generations. And that's where you, who are in positions of influence in churches and high schools and universities and so forth, can really add value to helping to build a movement, which is going to take years. But if we start with the younger people, we will eventually see, Larry and I might not, because combined we're 150 years old. 157. 157. Okay, I just don't feel that old. So you can help by using your influence in those places of influence that you have to get this going early and then watch it develop over time. And God's been really good to us. You take Liberty University alone, they have 10,500 in their School of Divinity. And we're teaching in the School of Divinity at Liberty.
I think we may have time for one more brief question. I'm sorry, Doctor, go ahead if you had something to say. Does someone else have another question? Brent Dunn.
Well, this is actually for Ron. And I'm trying to remember, you said something about this, but what size church do you think it would need to be to host a Kingdom Advisor study group? I think you said, you speculated in some way about how many churches where we might have a Kingdom Advisor study group organized. And maybe if you can use that question or that idea, maybe as an encouragement to the pastors that are in the room to look out for a portion of their flock and help them grow.
Well, I don't think it's the size of the church. I think it's the size of I think it's just the advisor who wants to put together the study group. I was asked one time by a pastor, he said, how do you keep the charlatans out? And I said, same way that banks teach tellers how to identify counterfeit money. They don't show them counterfeit money, they show them the real thing. So by showing them the real thing, the charlatans show up. And so taking a study group into a church or into a school or wherever is a really positive thing. So it can be any size.
I think one quick response I would have to that, 3 years ago, Beth and I and Justin and Phil were talking about our work there at Indiana Wesleyan, and we had a KA study group there on campus for our peer coaches and for advisors in the area and so on. And one of the things that we talked about, and we talked about with Rob and Sharon and Tony and Ron down at KA, was the idea is, what if we adapted this, the KA study group, for the university? Because it was a little bit out there, if you will, for our people in here at the university level, particularly the 18 to 22-year-old. And if you went to a church, you began to wonder about some of that is, what if we adapted or we had some KA study group type things contextualized to the church? So that's a what if. We've not put that in action planning, but we've discussed that before.
Thank you, Larry. I just wanted you all to know that Larry's background, he was 15 years with Zig Ziglar. Well, as he says, he was a basketball coach until he had 3 losing seasons here in Indiana. Then they made him a principal until he had 3 food fights in the cafeteria. And then they made him a superintendent, and that's when he met Zig Ziglar.
We went into impasse in negotiations, so I became a freelance consultant.
Okay. But he's had this background with Zig Ziglar taking curriculum or content, turning it into curriculum, which is a big deal. And then as chief of staff of the university and when he joined Indiana Wesleyan, they had 700 students, and then they got that to 15,000 while Larry was there as chief of staff. And I asked him, and then he was a provost, and I asked him if he would give me halftime. What he didn't realize is I meant 12 to 12. And so only 12 hours a day. But he has been a godsend. We're 10 years ahead of where we would be easily with the Institute had it not been for Larry. He had all of the experience and energy and ability to lead. And then with Beth and Phil, who have the commitment, Beth had the experience and Phil had the PhD and the experience in the high schools. God's put together, we didn't go out looking for anybody, but God's put together a team that is truly talented, and it's just a privilege for me to work with them, and I wanted to acknowledge all of them.
Thank you, Mr. Blue. Thank you to our panel. Thank you all very much.